Good morning, it's great to be alive. Good morning to you. How's everybody doing? Good morning. Oh, my niece is here. Hello, unique Donnie Dolly White. Why? She's probably like, why'd you use my whole government name? Hey, what's going on? Hi, Christina. And, Angelica's here. Amber, Annalisa. Hello, everybody. Good morning. All right, so I thought I'd come on, and yes, I am enjoying the day. Hey, Timer. I am. I hope you are too. Good morning. I came on because today is a new moon, and Mercury goes retrograde. Now, a couple things. Hey, Sujay. A couple things. One, a minor thing, and it is a minor thing, even though I'm making a deal of it, is that some people have gotten into the habit of saying Mercury in retrograde. Mercury symbolizes cars, but Mercury is not a car. So Mercury doesn't go in retrograde, right? He retrogrades, moves forward, but it's not Mercury in retrograde. Mercury retrograde, meaning that Mercury has gone or appears to be going backwards from the Earth's perspective. Hey, Kat. So that's one important thing to realize. Today is also a new moon, and I want to talk about this new moon. So Mercury is going retrograde at 8 degrees of Capricorn, which is pretty significant. I'm going to go into that. And then today's new moon is at 20 degrees of Sagittarius. So I also want to talk about 20 degrees Sagittarius and some things to reflect on. That's a little more Nick-tanastic, the kind of horoscopes I've been doing lately. So let's talk about this Mercury retrograde. This Mercury retrograde is really kind of special because Mercury starts his retrograde today, and he goes direct on the 1st of January. So it's like ringing in the new year with Mercury moving direct. And I think that's really kind of special. And it's also special because the retrogrades for 2024 are going to be mainly in fire signs, but there are a few that go from earth signs into fire, meaning that Mercury goes from being in an earth sign to going into a fire sign. So I also want to talk about the significance of Mercury going from an earth sign into a fire sign. So let's jump into it. First thing to know that's really important in cementing your understanding about Mercury retrograde is not to freak the fuck out. A lot of people seem to have gotten, and I'm going to say it, superstitious about Mercury retrograde with the implication that everything's about to go to shit. This isn't completely true for a lot of different reasons. What Mercury is doing is going toward a renewal cycle, meaning what happens, I'm going to picture this as the sun. Let's just have this as the sun, my palm or my hand. And this is Mercury, okay? So what's happening is Mercury has been an evening star. If you went out in the sky, you could see Mercury hanging out after the sun has gone down. And now what's happened is that Mercury has now completed its cycle through the zodiac, or its year, because it only takes 88 days on Mercury. And so Mercury now appears to be going backwards as we're moving forward through the zodiac. And he's going to go toward what we call an interior or inferior conjunction with the sun. This is like a new moon, just like what we're having today. So that's going to be some time from here in terms of Mercury being conjoined to the sun. And then from that point on, roughly Mercury is going to emerge as a morning star roughly in about 5-7 days, and then he's going to move direct. And then he's going to start the cycle going toward what's called the superior conjunction, which is when he's about to become an evening star. And you can think of that as more full moon. Okay, so what? Well, you went through all the astronomy of it. Well, the astronomy is very important because that gives us a clue on how to think about Mercury retrograde. The astronomy tells us that the reason why Mercury retrograde is so significant is that it signifies that Mercury, dealing with the things he deals with, which I call the three comms. What are the three comms? The three comms are communication, commerce, and commuting. Getting about, whether you're taking a plane, a train, a bus, a bike, whatever. Those are the aspects related to commuting. So as Mercury is about to go, or is going retrograde, what that signifies is those three areas of how we deal with our life are going toward renewal and how we deal with things. And so this renewal becomes important in getting us to think about how are we commuting, how are we communicating, how are we connecting, how are we doing business, whether we are a customer or business person. So those are the things to start thinking about. Okay, cool. So we have a sense that that Mercury is moving backwards. He's dealing with these three things. What's the significance of it? Well, here's the thing. Mercury is at 8 degrees Capricorn, and he'll be going back into Sagittarius. What really is shocking to many people who don't know as much astrology, and I'm encouraging you all to study astrology, and I'm not saying that you have to study with me or study with whoever. Actually, my niece is saying it, so it's like a reset button for your comms, and all those things related to it. One of the things to understand is that astrology is really not about the signs. A lot of people think like it's about the signs and, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Aquarius, all these different things. And it's really not. It doesn't mean it's not at all. It's not really about that. It's more about the planets, 1. 2, it's also about the degrees. Astrology really lives in understanding more about the degrees of each zodiac sign. Now, there are different theories. There's something called degree theory. There are some traditional astrologers my age, I'm 56. We're like, no, poo-poo. I think that's silly. I think there's something significant about degree theory. I don't practice it on a regular. And again, it's called degree theory. But there are older forms related to astrology that give some measure of significance. So this particular Mercury retrograde is tying in more about Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, which deals with the concept of how we have expansion, growth, both in terms of character and soul and mind, ways in which we start to formulate our better understanding. You're like, well, what's it got to do with Jupiter other than it's going to be in Sagittarius? Well, because there's something related to degree theory called dividing each particular sign into thirds, where there are 10 degrees each. So the first 10 degrees of Capricorn relate to Jupiter. And then in terms of something we call terms, which is dividing some measure of the chart by 5, and not as equally as we talk about face, or what we call also decans. And decans is one of the oldest systems of understanding each sign that directly comes to us from Egypt. It's actually, or Kemet, it's actually related to magic and the principle of magic. So another way in which this Mercury is hooked in is also through Jupiter. You're like, okay, cool. So what's the thing about Jupiter? One of the things I want you to think about, to live with, not just think about, but live with during this Mercury retrograde, is how do you know what you know? How do you deal with the elements of how you deal with the aspects of your growth related to Jupiter? How do you put into practice, considering that Mercury is starting off in an earth sign, with how you apply that, and then are you certain about the ways in which you practice, and is it based on true aspects of your knowledge? Meaning that you might have to dig up, your textbooks, your manuals. You might have to dig more into really refining your sense of understanding of things, which is another Jupiter word. In refining your understanding, How are you able to put that or gear yourself up to put that into practice? So that's one of the things to start thinking about as Mercury is going from 8 degrees of Capricorn going back into Sagittarius, where he arrives or where he is. So I'm using my trusty ephemeris because I couldn't remember the actual degree. So January 1st, 2024, Mercury is going to be at 22 degrees of Sagittarius. That's when he's going direct. Okay, cool. Now that's interesting because today we have a new moon at 20 degrees of Sagittarius. It's very close to where that Mercury lands up. Now, here's something to know about new moons and moons in general. I've said it before, but it always bears repeating because a lot of people don't know. First thing to know, this new moon is a correlate, meaning it has a connection to, it parallels a full moon that happened in 2019, roughly around the same date. In fact, I think it was the same date. But it was a full moon at 19 degrees Gemini. 4 years before, December 12th, 2015, we have another new moon roughly at 19 degrees of Sagittarius. You're like, oh, okay. So what? Well, the thing I want you to start connecting dots with is that we tend to think about signs in isolation. Like, Gemini, I'm a Gemini, right? I'm not a Gemini. My niece is a Gemini. I'm not a Gemini, right? But Gemini, Sagittarius, right? But here's the truth. The truth is they're along an axis. I always say you scratch an Aries hard enough, you're going to see a Libra. You scratch a Libra hard enough, you're going to see an Aries. There's a reflection that happens between the signs. And again, that's important. That doesn't mean they're not distinct and don't have distinct properties, but there's ways in which they're interwoven. So, because they operate on something we call an axis, whenever we're talking about this connection to this new moon, it harks back to the full moon that I just mentioned in 2019 and harks back to that new moon in 2015. You might think back to those years, around those times, on what was highlighted in your chart or being highlighted around those particular degrees. And when I say those degrees, you're talking about 19 Gemini and you're talking about 20 Sagittarius, roughly around those degrees. But, you know, we could be talking about 19 Sagittarius, 19 Gemini, 20 degrees Sagittarius, and 20 degrees of Gemini. They're along an axis. You're like, okay, so what does that mean? Well, on the basic level, you want to look at what it highlights or what planets it highlights in your chart. So if you have something roughly around those degrees, meaning, let's say, 15, or we can go even as high as 22, 23 degrees or 24 degrees of Sagittarius or Gemini, then it's going to be impactful related to that dimension of your life. Ganan! That's not Ganan, that's Prita. Hello, Prita. Afkase. So, in good morning. I don't know how to say good morning in Hindi. I've forgotten. Anyway, see, that was very mercurial. So looking at how these things are affected in your chart will give you some clue. Let me give you an example, because I believe in looking at by example. So in 2015, it was the prelude to just before I was going to be moving from my home at that point of nearly 11 years. So I was going to be moving to Newark and got the notice from my landlord shortly after that I would have to move. In 2019 is when I decided I was moving out west. Now, that got delayed because of this thing in 2020 called a pandemic. So I wasn't able to move that. So in terms of 2019 December, that's when I kind of crystallized the decision. You're like, okay, Sam, What's it in your chart? Well, my midheaven is at 17 degrees of Sagittarius. That means my IC related to my home is 17 degrees of Gemini. They're along an axis. So I knew that some things would be happening related to that axis in my life. So this is a way you can start using astrology related to specific degrees rather than just thinking about signs. Because when you start thinking about signs and you're talking about signs, I could tell you I live on West San Francisco Street in Santa Fe. I don't, but I'm just talking, right? Now, West San Francisco goes a pretty long way. So that doesn't tell you much, actually. You just be like calling down the street, yo, Sam, and, you might, considering how quiet it is in my neighborhood, you're probably going to get arrested. So that's not going to work for you. So your actual degrees gives me a lot more specific information. In fact, the degrees of your chart is like actually having like your social security number. I'm not kidding. This is why some people don't divulge their charts. They're not just trying to be funny. They just don't divulge that information because in the wrong hands, I'm just telling y'all, in the wrong hands, someone with your chart has some way of not just accessing understanding of you, but they can work with the heavens to kind of manipulate some things that affect your life. The thing that we call magic. It's not that hard. So, again, it just depends on how much you know or how much you want to know. But I digress. Anyway, this new moon correlates to what's also happening in this Mercury retrograde. So things related to it will give you some understanding. Let me give you another example of it. So one of the things that I think I told you last month or the month before last or whenever I got on here, I was talking to you about buying a home. Well, I just got approved for a mortgage, right? Yeah, so I can buy. Let's see what I can buy, right? In terms of getting a home. Yo, so Amani said the Scorpio jumped out. I don't know what you're talking about. Anyway, so this is happening just at the brink of this new moon, which is along my IC-MC axis, in terms of looking for a home. Thank you, Cassandra. So this is how astrology can work when you know the particular dimensions of your chart. Now, you're like, well, when's the sale pitch going to come in, Sam? Well, I stay busy, so you can always book with me, right? You can go to unlockastrology.com and book. But I believe in also you being able to do this for yourself, because that's how I started. So you can go to a couple of sites. You can go to astro-seek.com and get your chart there and put in your information, looking up your time of birth. You also can go to astro.com and look up your chart. And then you can go to another site that I like, Luna Astrology, all one word, so there's 2 A's, lunaastrology.com, and also get your chart. And that's one way in which you can figure out more so where the degrees are and where this Mercury and where this new moon is landing in your chart, and you can proceed accordingly. So I want you to contemplate that. Now, one thing I haven't talked about as much, I'm going to talk about a few things that are controversial. You're like, well, Sam, you're talking about planets and you're talking about degrees, and there's something called angles in your chart, like your ascendant, which is where your chart starts and rises. And then your midheaven, which is at what seems to be the very top of your chart. Then on the opposite end is your descendant, right? And that is where your relationship to others. And then there's your IC, right? Which is kind of near the bottom of the chart. So Annalisa's putting in, and it's astro-seek.com. They have con, but it's, and they're making the correction, but it's also scrolling through. So, so let me repeat these. astro-seek.com, astro.com, lunaastrology.com. Okay, so these are your angles, right? If they fit together in terms of that. So the angles give you some very strong clue on what's getting activated in your chart because they're the most powerful positions in your chart. There are some astrologers, and I'm not knocking them at all, who believe that, new moons, full moons, all these different lunations, including eclipses, will activate things by house. I think that's somewhat true, but I don't make a big deal of it if it's not one of the angles. That doesn't mean it's not a deal at all. So if you have, let's say, for instance, you're an Aquarius rising. So this means that this new moon is going to be activating in your 11th house. So that may be related to your groups, associations, your friends. It may also be dealing with, believe it or not, because this is not talked about enough with the 11th house, it also may be the money that you make from your work, from your job even. So yeah, money could get funny, but this is the thing that can happen during a Mercury retrograde. So that is something to take into account. The other controversial thing, and this is where I want you to check out my boy, Gary Caton. He goes by Dream Astrologer. I think on Instagram it's Dream Astrologer. This is where he actually changed my mind, which is kind of hard to do for a fixed sign, but he did change my mind some years back. There's a lot of talk, and a friend of mine was talking about, and I kind of blew her mind the other day, where she was talking about the thing called the shadow, the Mercury retrograde shadow. And this is something that was developed by an astrologer some years back, I would say about 30 years back. The idea that as Mercury hit roughly around 22 degrees Sag, the place where it's going to go direct, we were in the shadow of Mercury retrograde. Gary challenges that idea, and I agree with him. It's not so much that we don't have a sense of the Mercury retrograde happening or coming to be in the first 2 weeks before the Mercury retrograde or so. It's not that, but there's a different reason than just looking at things related to the actual degree position of the Mercury. Let me explain. So just to make sure that it's concrete, and I'm going to use my finger here as Mercury. So what happens with Mercury, let's say when he was at 22 degrees of Sagittarius some weeks, maybe a week or two ago, he was that initiates what we call now the shadow. And now that he's going to be going retrograde at 8 degrees of Capricorn, we say now that we were living in the shadow, now the fit has really hit the shan. Here's the problem with that. When you look at the night sky, when you really actually look at the night sky, Mercury's retrograde at 22, from this particular position of 22 degrees Sagittarius, Mercury actually did something like this. And then it starts to retrograde. Notice how my hand is moving. Then it loops, and then it ends at, or I should say it loops, and then it ends at 22 degrees of Sagittarius. The same position where we say the shadow starts. But it moves like this. If we're looking at in three-dimensional space, it actually isn't at the same position as it was. It crosses what we call the ecliptic and ends up at a different position in the sky. You're like, okay, so what? Well, if I tell you that I'm going to the store around the corner from my house, or I'm going to a cafe around the corner from my house, and I take this little other way, because there is a way from my house where you can kind of go a shortcut. If I take this shortcut to get to that cafe, but then I go back home the long way, even though I started from home but took the shortcut and then went back the long way, is that the same? Was I in the shadow of myself or the shadow of my journey? No. Mercury doesn't travel in the sky the same way he moves during a retrograde. So the shadow is only based on one particular aspect of a degree that's not looking at three-dimensional space. This means, it's an implication. The implication is that it has meaning related to fourth and fifth dimensions of space, in terms of space-time, meaning consciousness. So when you talk about the shadow of Mercury, you're talking also about like, oh, I'm going along the same trajectory of my consciousness. No, the fuck you're not. Nobody does with a Mercury retrograde. Some way it's going to shift. And if you have to be willing for it to shift. So this is why the shadow is incomplete. I don't go as far as Gary and saying like it's trash, but I think it's not complete in looking at 3 dimensions of space and even 4th and 5th dimensions and understanding its movement in the actual sky. And its movement in the actual sky is really important to understand. It's going toward a renewal. This is a point where we can renew ourselves and experience a different sense of our energies, our understanding related to communication, to commerce and commuting. So what does this mean practically? It means that you really have to think about things and plan. So for instance, if you have a flight to catch and you usually, like when I lived in Newark, the great thing about living in Newark where I lived, I was 7 minutes from the airport. Now, during a Mercury retrograde, I wouldn't just take advantage of those 7 minutes, meaning I might like, okay, I can get to the airport in 7 minutes and then have that 30 minutes. That means I probably should leave maybe twice that amount of time, 14 minutes earlier, or I might leave 20 minutes earlier. It's kind of with this reset, you have to think about, well, what are the things that I can modify related to my commute or my travels and, put in some measure of cushion. The more that you have some sense of cushion related to that, that's how things improve. Same thing related to commerce, paying attention to the money that you spend. And I don't mean just in terms of budget. I mean, like, as we, I know everything is kind of digital now, but count your change, count your money that you get back. Pay attention to what's in your account. Look at your bank statements a little closer. Review your subscriptions. Do you really need Disney Plus and Paramount Plus and Showtime Plus and what's now called Max, not HBO? Do you need all these things? Are you looking at them? Are you using them? It's a way to think about all the ways in which you're kind of saddled up related to those 3 comms. All right, so I've talked about 27 minutes. One great thing that I think about the live is that I can answer questions before I start office hours. So I want to give you time to ask any questions if you have any questions. And some people may have questions, so I'm going to give you space to type them in. Yeah, I mentioned office hours, and y'all may be wondering, like, I don't know about your office hours. Well, they're for my students. When you enroll in my classes, nitty-gritty 1, 2, 3, now 4, I have office hours. So it's an hour where we can get together and talk about how they're learning and how their learning adventure is going. One other small thing before, because I don't see anyone asking any questions yet, is that tomorrow, speaking of Mercury, tomorrow I'm going to be appearing with King Simon to talk about, he's a numerologist, so I'm going to talk about astrology and my journey with astrology. I've known King Simon, I want to say for about 15 years when I met him in Bed-Stuy. So we're talking about astrology, numerology, and these particular things. So Happy Seventh Face has asked, what's the question? I'm talking about Mercury retrograde at 8 degrees of Capricorn and the new moon at 20 degrees of Sagittarius. What differences might we see between Mercury retrograde and Capricorn? This is from Jenna, from Lady Patience, from Capricorn versus Sagittarius. So in Capricorn, we're going to be thinking about how we're applying what we know, the usefulness of what we know, thinking about the practicality, the day-to-day sense of the operations. Sagittarius is always thinking more about the big picture. The knowledge before you think about the application related to this. It's going to be also the passion because it's a fire sign. So there's passion and there's practice, right? So this may be where we're kind of making the journey between practice into passion. What does this mean practically? I'll use what I do for an example. So one of the things I'm reviewing and looking at closer, I'm looking at house significations because I'm also having a roiling private debate with a friend of mine. And so this is, where I'm looking at the elements of practice, but then I'm going to be revising probably more my knowledge set and my passion related to it. Also finding more of my sense of my passion, not just related to astrology, but particular arenas of astrology. So when we're talking about Sagittarius, we're talking about the adventure. We're talking about what gets us out. When we're talking about Capricorn, we're talking about, all the things related to having arrived related to the adventure. So with it going backwards, it's kind of revising what started us on the journey in the first place. So Laurie Sybil is typing a question, so I look for it. So basically what we're experiencing is a difference in route pre and post retrograde. See, that's why you need Aries to say things succinctly, which they did. Yes, I know you're going to clown yourself for your Mercury, and I'm not going to go into your Mercury position, but I think the Mercury in that particular sign is brilliant, and I've told you that, so thank you. Yeah, it's about the route. What's significant about the last new moon of the year and before the winter solstice? That's an interesting question, Lorianne. Well, I mean, we're going toward the finish of the year, and I think coupled with the fact that it's a Mercury retrograde, it's a couple things. If you're into Christmas, I would say you probably need to do your Christmas shopping sooner than later. It's kind of more finishing your year. And finishing your year, and considering that it's moving into Sagittarius, what's your big picture for the year? What are you thinking about related to, as we're like now roughly 9-10 days from the solstice? What are you preparing for? Which is generally true, I think, for most times around this time of year. But to have a new moon, it's kind of dealing with a new endeavor and planning it. Should we read transits in relation to our progress charts as well? Because Sandra's asked this question. It's a very interesting question. First, I need to explain for those who may not know, what are progress charts? So the idea is that, and I believe what Cassandra's talking about are secondary progress charts, because there's various different types of progressions. The idea behind secondary progress charts is that we imagine every year of life you live as a day after you were born. So if you've lived 30 years, we imagine 30 days after you were born. So each planet is going to be correlate, or the position of it, to each day after you've been born, and that's going to be 30 days. Now, that doesn't mean, for instance, like if you're 29 degrees Sagittarius and 30 days afterwards, you're going into Capricorn, or you've gone now into going toward Aquarius, actually. That doesn't mean you stop being a Sagittarius. What it does mean is, one way to think about it is that your natal chart is your blueprint. The blueprint, like of this house you see, is the blueprint that, in terms of the beams and everything you see, is as laid out. What gets put into the house, where this bookshelf is, that picture, that other picture, the bike you see in the back, all those things relate to your progressions. What have been added to. So your progressions become a way of understanding what has changed or matured or progressed in your chart related from your natal signification. You're like, okay, cool. Well, what about the transits? So the transits do become important as highlighting what particular things now are activated. And it does depend on the planet. So for instance, if you have a planet that's progressed into Pisces, chances are you're going to be dealing with the heaviness in some way, the gravitas, the discipline, the structure of Saturn. So Saturn's going to become important in that particular way. I don't think every transit becomes important or noticeable related to every particular aspect of your progression. But in general, there is a way, and you should be able to look at that, and that will help you. Okay, so I have Mercury in Aries. Oh yeah, I was talking about you woman, you. She knows what I'm talking about in terms of the position of her Mercury. Okay, well, yeah, if there's not one last question I'm willing to take, and Ursula, ¿cómo estás? Bienvenido. Happy to see you here. Anyone else have any parting questions before I dance away? What's up, Gabe? Thank you. You have a great day as well. I had a great day yesterday. I'm looking forward to a great day today. I am going to save this live, and then I will post it, inshallah. And then I also will add captions. Someone has asked me to do that. I hope it's pretty easy to do. Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Harmony. Through astrology. Sujay. Sujay, are you in India too? He's like, two? Are you in India? No, I'm not in India. I was talking about my friend Preeta. Thank you, Timer. Hey, Gianna. Thank you. I am on YouTube. Unlock Astrology. You should find me. All right, Sujay. All right. Yeah, I hope to make it to India sometime soon. I haven't been there in a long time, since 2007. It's time for me to get back. Thank you. I'm looking forward to finding a home. So now we'll see that. All right. Angelica, thank you. All right. Well, Bangalore. Yeah, I don't think I made it to Bangalore, but that will be on my list. Okay, everyone. All right. Take care. Enjoy. And, oh, my niece is telling me she's going to call me later. Love you too, honey. All right. Bye, everyone.